All right, this is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 15, Section 2, Early Mobilization and War. So after the first shots were fired, at Fort Sumter, both sides were very enthusiastic about the war. And both the North and the South had expectations that this was going to be a short and not necessarily bloodless, but not too much blood. We'll just use the word bloodless, right? That it wouldn't be a 4-year long war that ended up being the deadliest conflict in American history. That's not what expectations were. And especially for the North, the North expectation was to win quickly. The North had pretty much all the meaningful advantages. If you were a Northerner in 1861, you would expect that your side should win quickly. Those expectations and that enthusiasm changed, quite quickly. The very first, or the most significant, I should say, the very first land engagement was the Battle of Bull Run. This was a battle that was fought in Virginia. Especially for the Union side, the North, they believed that this war would be as simple as, raise an army and march right towards the Confederate capital, which was Richmond, Virginia. So Richmond, Virginia, this was the Confederate capital city. And because the Union had a larger army, a more well-equipped army, it would capture Richmond, Virginia, and the war would be over just like that. Lincoln also issued a naval blockade throughout the entire course of the war. The Union or the North would have naval supremacy. They would control the seas. But when the two armies met at Manassas Creek, or Manassas or Bull Run Creek, as I should say, where Confederate troops were dispatched in order to defend Richmond, Virginia, it resulted in a Confederate victory. And the Confederate victory at the Battle of Bull Run, which we'll call the first major battle of the Civil War, at least land battle. Here you see it depicted in this image. The Confederate victory really changed expectations, especially for the North. For the North, it was realized that this war wouldn't be as simple as just, marching right towards Richmond, Virginia, and taking over the Confederate capital. So both sides prepared for a much longer and drawn-out conflict. Now, when we look at the balance sheet, and by the balance sheet, we sort of mean the advantages and disadvantages, it was the North or the Union that had pretty much all of the meaningful advantages in the war. That's not to say that the Confederacy didn't have some advantages, right? One thing we can point to is the fact that the nature of this war, due to the fact the Confederacy has broken away, it's really up to the Union then to go into the South and bring the Confederacy back. The Confederates can fight a defensive war, right? So we might say about the Confederates, we'll say the South simply needs to defend. There's really nothing motivating this, or there's really no objective that the South needs to go into Union territory, just essentially needs to protect its own borders. And also the fact that the Southern geography is also an advantage. The South is very big. It has a very large coastline, which makes, it makes trying to blockade it very difficult. Most battles would be fought in the South. There was a familiarity with the terrain in the South by the Confederate side. So we might be able to point to these as, these are potentially some advantages for the South. However, the more meaningful ones really didn't work in their favor. So, for example, all during the course of the war, the South would struggle with its wartime economy. Recall that the Southern economy is pretty much all cotton, right? And even though cotton is a very valuable export, cotton is not useful essentially for fighting a war. What the South would have to do is to turn that cotton into money, and then turn that money into things like guns and other war supplies. And that was difficult given the blockade. Could the South continue to ship out cotton, receive money in return, and then purchase these items from other countries? That would be very, very difficult. It was also true that the South was very short on finances or money, especially in terms of like what we might call like liquid wealth. And by that I mean wealth that you can easily take and translate it into supplies. Much of the Southern wealth was in land and slaves. The South was worth a lot, but to take land and slaves and then make that into something that could be useful for a war, it was very difficult to do. The South responded by printing money. That's all they could do. And printing money led to very high inflation in the South. This is something that I think is often overlooked, but wars are expensive. And a lot of times it comes down to which side has more money. And in this case, it wasn't the South. And also population. In the South, there were 9 million people. 4 million of those people were enslaved. So of the potential population that could serve in the army, there was perhaps a pool of only 5 million men that the South could potentially draft from. So all of these things, the economy, the finances, the population, all these things ended up being disadvantages for the South. And again, those things like guns, money, finance, or guns, money, and people, right? Those are kind of the key ingredients that are necessary for fighting a war. For the North had a way bigger population, 21 million people, none of which are enslaved. The North had all the meaningful industry and railroads. That means that they could make and also transport war supplies, which was very important. The factories in the North could mass produce guns, mass produce, military uniforms, other equipment, bullets, everything that was needed. And the railroads can transport all that. It could also transport food. The South, for example, was very agrarian. During the Civil War, the South could grow enough food to feed its armies, but the South couldn't transport it because there was a lack of infrastructure there. For the disadvantages of the North is, the sort of nature or tactics or strategy associated with the with the war. Ultimately, it would be up to the North to attack the South. So we might say the North had to attack the South. Again, the South is breaking away. The North has to go into the South and bring them back in. So that means fighting on unfamiliar territory. It means stretching supply lines out, to keep Union soldiers supplied well beyond enemy lines. The South is very big, so that worked as a disadvantage for the North. Now, disadvantage. Now, after the Battle of Bull Run, in which the Confederacy won, which was a shock, of course, to the North, the Union sort of changed their strategy a little bit. They brought up or called for a larger army and, would sort of go round two, so to speak. Now, the war itself, the Civil War, was fought primarily in two different areas. The first one is surrounding Virginia. We sometimes refer to this as the Virginia Theater. So we might say these are the battles in and around Virginia. In the Virginia Theater, this would be kind of where the largest battles would take place, the most meaningful battles would take place. In Virginia, the war would be either won or lost. And essentially, what each side was trying to do was to capture the other one's capital city. So Richmond's the Confederate capital, DC is the Union's capital. So we might say each side wanted to capture the capital city. Capital city. I see this cartoon here showing sort of the stalemate that occurred. The general-in-chief was in charge of Union forces, so we'll say general in charge of Union forces. The man who was responsible for making the Union victory possible was George McClellan, so he was in charge of the Union armies. The one thing to note about George McClellan is that his tactics were far too passive. The North had, in the Virginia theater in 1861 and 1862, had an advantage in terms of having a much larger army, much better supplied army, but McClellan never really took the initiative to attack. The troops or the forces that he was in charge of was called the Army of the Potomac. This is the Union Army. Which, the strategy was to attack Richmond, Virginia. So we'll just say Union Army used to attack Richmond, Virginia. And of course, George McClellan was in charge of it, right? In charge of Army of the Potomac. Charge of. Now, like we said before, McClellan himself was too passive. Ultimately, McClellan and the Army of the Potomac failed to capture Richmond, Virginia. This was in part just to probably more responsibility falls on McClellan for just not using his advantage in terms of supplies and men. It was also due to Confederate generals such as Thomas Stonewall Jackson. This was a Confederate general who helped to stall Union advances. And soon enough, the Army of the Potomac, which initially had set out to capture Richmond, Virginia, found itself on the retreat. And instead, it was Confederate armies that were marching towards Washington, D.C. So sort of a change in terms of who was pursuing who. At the Second Battle of Bull Run, Confederate and Union forces met once again. This time, Confederate forces on their way, marching towards Washington, D.C. This resulted in a Confederate victory. And for the very first time during the course of the war, the unthinkable happened, or at least what was perceived as unthinkable, and that was what led up to the Battle of Antietam, which was fought in Maryland. And that was Confederate forces invaded Union territory. Right. So if you think about what the expectations were initially in the war, that the war would be over very quickly, that it wouldn't be that bloody, and especially for the North, who expected a very quick victory, not only had the North not achieved a quick victory, but in 1862, they were on the retreat. And by that time, Confederate forces were essentially marching in Union territory, which again, given all the advantages and disadvantages of the conflict, that was something that you can't really explain it besides just being a disaster for Union forces. Ultimately, at the Battle of Antietam, Confederate forces were defeated in a very, very, very bloody battle, retreating back to the South, retreating back to Virginia. But this prompted Abraham Lincoln to fire George McClellan. And really, for the rest of the war, Lincoln will be in search of a competent general, someone who can use the northern advantages. So early on in the war, Virginia and the Virginia theater was a disaster for the Union. The other main area in which the war was fought was the Western theater. This is pretty much all of the battles not associated with Virginia, not associated with trying to capture the capital city of your opponent. In the Western theater, it was more about the Union trying to control various rivers and railroads. So the way that Confederate armies in Virginia were supplied was by using rivers and railroads. In the West, we're talking about places like Tennessee. The goal of Union generals was to invade Southern territory and take over those railroads, take over those rivers, so that Confederate armies could not be supplied. The Army of the West was the title given to Union forces here, and it was headed by Ulysses S. Grant, Union general. In the West. And Grant, unlike Virginia, unlike McClellan, was very successful. Even the hotly contested battle at Shiloh, so this was a battle. Heavy losses, but still a Union victory. Right? We might want to note that both Antietam, right, this battle here, and Shiloh were especially bloody affairs. And it proved that even in 1861 and 1862, the fact that both sides at Antietam and Shiloh were willing to fight essentially to death, that this war would continue on and it would continue to get more bloody as the years go by.